In the previous chapters, we described the changes that psychedelia affected in rock and roll. In this episode we shall broaden our outlook a little bit, and talk about how it changed youth culture at large. Because rock and roll, after all, was music that belonged to a generation that rebelled against the previous generations and created its own culture. Psychedelia was the stage which youth culture reached in 1967, and as we shall see, it fundamentally changed because of it. We mentioned the main reason for the generational gap. When the American youth adopted black rhythm and blues and called it rock and roll, they did something that went completely against the logic of the dominant culture, which regarded black culture as an expression of the primitive man who comes from the jungle, something we need to get away from. From here, rock and roll and youth culture developed by their own logic, and the main driving force in the 60s were the Brits. We must, therefore, talk a little bit about British culture, and what rock and roll did to it. The following description will be extremely superficial and succinct, but I hope it will give us the general idea. In Britain and Europe, traditionally, everything revolves around class. Until the 19th century, the nobility was in power, and it let the lower classes work for it, while the noblemen spent their time in recreational fun and war games. The aristocrats saw themselves as raised above the rest, and took pride in their refined manners and fancy clothes, which distinguished them from the commoners. Then, the bourgeoisie gradually took over. The bourgeoisie established a democratic society, which held that all men were born free and equal, and aspired to create a society that was as free and equal as possible. In contrast with the aristocracy's frivolity, which they regarded as vacuous, the bourgeoisie instilled ethics of working hard for a better tomorrow, of Christian morality, and of enlightened thought that believed in freedom, equality, and fraternity. The bourgeoisie adopted the aristocratic notion that man should be civilized and not act like a brute, but they were more reserved about it than the noblemen, and their dress was tidy but not flamboyant. The economic system they promoted was free market capitalism, which was supposed to turn all men into property owners, and thus more free. But instead, capitalism created another split between two classes. On the one side were the bourgeoisie employers, and on the other side were the proletariat, the working class, who were employed by them. The working class people spent almost all of their time working, so they didn't get the chance to have an education, refine their behavior, and be enlightened, free and equal. A new struggle began, a socialist struggle to grant rights to the proletariat, so they can advance as well. This struggle won many victories, and after World War II the Western world was essentially taken over by the concept of the welfare state, a state that actively works to help the lower classes ascend to an equal level. In Britain, a Labour government was in control, and it passed socialist reforms and enacted a policy of zero unemployment. The paths were open before the working class, and the belief was that this will bring a utopian society with full equality. The nobility, meanwhile, kept on regarding themselves as raised above others, and one way of showing it was their more refined sense of style. In the late 1940s, the fashion industry catered to them by creating the Edwardian suit, which was based on the aristocratic fashion of the days of King Edward VII, 5 decades earlier. The fashion industry was hoping that the aristocrats will buy these clothes to try and relive past glories. But then, something unprecedented and unfathomable happened, something that shook the welfare state to its core. Instead of the aristocrats, it was actually the working class kids who bought these suits. The working class always mocked the fashion sense of the nobility and saw it as a sign of effeminacy, and wouldn't be caught dead wearing such clothes. But this new generation of proletarians appropriated the Edwardian suit, introduced some modifications, and made it its own. The high classes, obviously, did not want to buy a suit that was associated with the lower classes, and so it became a style that was purely a youth working class thing. By the mid-50s, the media started to refer to these kids as teddy boys. The dominant culture was shocked and horrified by this phenomenon. When the aristocrats wore dapper clothes and flaunted their differences from others, it could be perceived as a relic from the past that will eventually disappear. But the working class was expected to take the chance opened by the welfare state, and become like the middle class, become part of society. Instead, these kids, who had money and time like no working class generation before them ever had, chose to spend them on a vacuous occupation like wearing fancy clothes. Moreover, for the aristocrats, dandyism was an expression of individualism and refinement, and each had their own style and taste. The teddy boys, on the other hand, adopted a uniform look, defiantly preserved the working class vulgarity, and wore their clothes while doing their thuggish activities. The long, many-pocketed jacket of the Edwardian suit, it turned out, was perfect for concealing knives and other bad business. It's understandable, then, why they threatened all the axioms that the welfare state was based on. The prevailing perception was that man wants to be a free and unique individual, and given the chance all humans will choose it, and get over the old tribal divisions. But here you had kids who were free, and chose to form a new tribe, with a collective identity. There were some commenters who claimed that since there is no way humans would choose to do that of their own free will, we must deduce that the Teddy Boys belong to a different species of human, a more animalistic type which would rather live in a herd. The Teddy Boys weren't more violent than other kids of their age and background, but any act of crime and hooliganism performed by a kid in an Edwardian suit was widely reported in the media, giving them an image of wild beasts and a social disease that must be eradicated. But the Teddy Boys were not beasts. They simply belonged to a new generation, a generation with different insights, some of which were discussed in previous chapters. Since they grew up into a welfare state, they felt secure in their financial situation, and so they cared less about it, and the idea that they should spend their time trying to close the gap with the high classes didn't appeal to them. What they wanted to do with their free time is have fun, feel elation. Their tribalism was an expression of their sense of unity against the adult world, stuck in its old ways, and the Edwardian suits appealed to them because they looked like gangster suits in Hollywood movies, which they idolized as models of a life lived for danger, thrills and style. The Teddy Boys appeared on the scene in 1953, and within a couple of years they had music to express their diversions. The rock and roll that came from America, and provided an abundance of thrills, elations and fun. Rock and roll stars like Bill Haley and Elvis Presley were quite the dandies themselves, and became role models for the Teddy Boys, especially when it came to growing your hair and stylizing it with gel. In the eyes of the dominant British culture, of course, the adoption of rock and roll by the Teddy Boys only enhanced its image as a barbaric, violent and antisocial cultural phenomenon. By the end of the 50s, the atmosphere changed. The fashion industry realized that the Teddy Boys actually opened the possibility for a large new market, and started making suits aimed at working class youth. Once the Teddy Boys broke the taboo, working class kids no longer had a problem with wearing them, and society got used to the idea that the lower classes also want to dress nicely. Rock and roll changed as well, and became more refined, so the Teddy Boys didn't look so weird and threatening anymore. But not all Teddy Boys liked the fact that they were more acceptable now. There were some Teds who liked it better when they were the feared rebels, and wanted to go back to that period. And since their style lost its power to intimidate, they looked for a new style, and found it. The inspiration, once again, came from American cinema, this time from a 1953 movie called The Wild One. The movie reenacts a true case that happened in 1947, when two rival biker gangs arrived at a small and peaceful American town, and the fight that broke between them turned into a 3-day brawl that wreaked havoc on the place. The movie, of course, stylizes the conflict. One gang is completely wild, dressed in a disheveled manner and led by the coarse Lee Marvin. The other gang is super cool, dressed in a uniform look of boots, jeans and black leather jackets, and led by the sensitive and tormented Marlon Brando. This was meant to get the young viewers to identify with Brando, who is going through a journey in the movie and starts to doubt his way of life, wondering if it wouldn't be better to conform and become part of society. But the British censor decided that this movie could inspire youngsters to violence, and did not allow it to be shown in the British Isles, leaving the youth only with the posters of the leather-clad Brando sitting on his motorbike. The result, of course, was that the British kids had to let their imagination tell them what was happening in the movie, and their imagination made it a lot wilder than it actually was. The biker became a mythical figure, a symbol of unruly life, and those kids who wanted to maintain the rebellious spirits of the Teddy Boys adopted it wholesale, and formed a new youth subculture, that became known as rockers. The rockers rejected the more tame and sophisticated rock and roll of the early 60s, and remained faithful to original rock and roll. And in that, too, they didn't like everything that was dubbed rock and roll, but only the rock and roll that had an eruptive quality, that feeling that a bike gives you when you accelerate from 0 to 100, that feeling you get that your soul is lashing against the world. Only that type of music was real rock and roll to them. With their motorbikes and their dangerous riding stunts, the rockers instilled youth culture with the idea that life should always be lived on the edge, and it is better to live an exciting life and die young than to rot for decades in the boring life of conformed bourgeois society. And with their greasy hair, clothes that reeked of gasoline, intimidating garb and noisy bikes, the rockers put fear at the heart of respectable people, and were considered animals by them. The group identity was even more uniform than that of the Teddy Boys. With the outfit and the helmet, crashed on his bike and merging with it into a fuzzy entity passing by you at high speed, every rocker was like the next. This was a style that the industry could not incorporate and tame. When the Beatles started out, they had the rocker look, with the jeans and leather jackets. They also had the same musical taste, and would play this eruptive rock and roll better than any other northern band. They even found ways to take the refined early 60s rock and roll and make it sound wild. They were so good that the Hamburg Club offered them a 1-year contract, and when they came back to Liverpool from Germany, they brought with them something that made them look different from any other band. Instead of the greased and combed back hair of the rockers, they adopted the haircut of German bohemians, looking like a woolly mop top. And musically, they were even tighter, and the name began to spread around town. They were famous enough to draw the attention of a local record store owner named Brian Epstein, and he managed to convince the lads to take him as manager. His first managerial act was to change their look. He knew that the rocker look may look cool for rock and roll kids, but would make the rest of society reject the band without even listening to it. Something more subtle was needed, so Epstein put the boys in smart suits, and that's how he presented them to the world. And so, the Beatles confused all the traditional divisions. On the one hand, they were working class kids from Liverpool, the bottom of the barrel of English society, but on the other hand they looked like erudite gentlemen. On the one hand they had long hair, like those brutish Teds and rockers, but on the other hand it was clean and stylized like upper class kids. On the one hand they played that barbaric American rock and roll, but on the other hand they had the sophistication of contemporary youth pop, and they also drew from English music hall and integrated it into their style. And their lyrics seemed very innocent, dealing with the primal sensations of youth, but the exhilarating way in which they performed them suggested more carnal experiences. Thus, the Beatles managed to take British culture by storm, infuse rock and roll and teen rebellion into its heart, without giving the moralists any excuse to shut them down. In mid-1963, the British press began to report on a new phenomenon, spreading like wildfire through the kingdom's youth, and called it Beatlemania. By the end of the year, it has taken over the entire island, and even the press capitulated before it. In the Beatles' wake, many more Liverpool and Manchester bands were signed, and their musical style became known as Mersey Beat. They were all basically trying to imitate the Beatles style, with the suits and the cheeky but unthreatening behavior, and music that combined rock and roll with British music hall. But they didn't have the power of the Beatles, and they made the style come over as juvenile, which was why it was rejected by kids who regarded themselves as more sophisticated. In the London area, in particular, a different subculture emerged, out of the more educated and well-to-do working class. In the 50s, this youth found itself through jazz, but the scene was divided into two hostile camps. On the one side were the trads, which upheld the original jazz of New Orleans, and they dressed in a slovenly way to signify their connection to humanity's roots, in contrast with the tidily dressed modern urban man. On the other side were the modernists, who preferred the sophisticated modern jazz from bebop onwards, and dressed snazzy to signify their sophistication. Within the jazz scene that developed in the city, there were also some rhythm and blues bands, playing simpler music, and the modernists didn't think much of them. But for the younger kids on the scene, the kids who grew up on rock and roll and started to look for replacements in the end of the 50s, rhythm and blues was the deepest music of all. These kids became part of the modernist scene, adopted the elegant dress code, but preferred rhythm and blues to jazz. Needless to say, the original modernists regarded these kids as miserable imitators, a shallow expression of the culture, and therefore they did not accept them into the subculture and referred to them derisively as mods. But the mods soon developed their own taste, and became another youth subculture. Like the rockers, the mods did not want to be incorporated by the industry, but their solution was different. While the rockers invented a style that could not be appropriated and diluted, the mods simply regenerated on a regular basis, remaining one step ahead of the industry. The mods belonged to a generation that was better educated than any working class generation ever was, a generation that internalized the ideas of the higher classes and wanted to express them in their way, the way of rebellious rock and roll kids. They kept their hair short and clean but stylized, their outfit was always dapper, and unlike the Teds and rockers they used their clothes to express their individuality. Every mod aspired to be the one to dictate the next fashion craze, and they always looked for something new, not only in fashion but also in music. And they, too, soon began to form their own bands. The music that the mods were drawn to at first was the rhythm and blues of Chicago, a city in which, in order to deal with life in the noisy and hectic metropolitan, the black musicians electrified the blues and played it with pounding and searing power. In the face of an urban world that repressed them financially, socially and spiritually, the Chicago musicians created an imaginary world in which they were an invincible man, who takes on everything and wins. The British kids were first introduced to this music through Chicago rock and roll musicians like Chuck Berry and Bo Diddley, but then they started to dig deeper and found the rhythm and blues records that had more mature content, made by musicians like Howlin' Wolf, Willie Dixon, Little Walter, and, above all, Muddy Waters.
Well, you know the hoochie coochie man. Everybody knows the pill.
The London's working class youth found in these records an echo of their own problems and struggles, and an expression of individualistic rebellion. It was also music that treated sexuality in a more direct way than rock and roll, and that too spoke to a generation that wanted to get rid of the old Victorian inhibitions. Out of this scene emerged a band that called itself after a Muddy Waters song, the Rolling Stones. The Stones played Chicago-style rhythm and blues, but they were also influenced by the Beatles, so they played it in the eruptive and ecstatic style of the Fab Four, creating something that was more aggressive than both Mercy Beat and black R&B. They soon made a name for themselves on the mod scene, and even drew the attention of the Beatles, especially the attention of Brian Epstein's assistant, a young lad called Andrew Loog Oldham. Oldham was looking for a band he could manage on his own, and he convinced the Stones to take him as their manager. Once he got the job, he proceeded to employ a tactic that was the exact opposite of Epstein's. Rather than taming the wild side of their music and image, he accentuated it. Oldham embarked on a PR campaign that portrayed the Rolling Stones as a symbol of unbridled youth rebellion, a force that has come to corrupt your sons, and even worse, your daughters. And it worked. From today's perspective, it's hard for us to understand what was so terrifying about the Rolling Stones. What makes them so different from the lovable Beatles? The haircuts, for instance, look almost similar. Except that the haircuts of the Beatles were tidy and precise, so for the so-called civilized society, they symbolize the process of the proletariat cleaning themselves up of the dirt of their lowly past. Whereas the Stones' haircuts always had some unruly locks, symbolizing that they are giving up on civilization and choosing chaos and anarchy. The Stones were portrayed in the media as filthy animals, something that came from the zoo, a menace to society. And they did their best to contribute to that image. The two guitarists Brian Jones and Keith Richards were rakish youngsters who did everything to live up to their notoriety. The bassist Bill Wyman was a sex maniac who utilized his rock star position to get as much pussy as possible. The stone-faced drummer Charlie Watts came over as an emotionless robot oblivious to the world. And the singer Mick Jagger wiggled around on stage and sang in a sexual way that only black singers before him dared to do. In the photographs they always came over as cool and menacing, and their music attempted to be the antithesis of the Beatles. There were no harmonies, music hall numbers and sweet nothings in their performance. They were there to rock and shock your world. Their first hit, I Wanna Be Your Man, was written for them by the Beatles, who recorded it themselves slightly later. And the two versions exemplify the difference between the two rival bands. The Beatles are cajoling, promising that you will have a good time if you let them be your man. Jagger, on the other hand, sounds like he is telling you that he's going to be your man, and there's not much you can say about it. This possessive approach was something they learned from the Chicago singers, and it will typify their future records as well. And the Rolling Stones kept on throughout the 60s being a symbol for everything that was wild, dangerous, rebellious and antisocial. And so, when psychedelia came and colored the world in glowing and optimistic rainbow colors, the first psychedelic record by the Stones announced that they would rather paint the whole world black as an expression to the darkness in their soul. but the dirty image of the Stones caused them to detach from the mods, who, as we recall, put elegance above all. The place was taken by other bands, and the next band to become the leader of the scene was the Yardbirds. What put the Yardbirds above all else was their lead guitarist. No one in Britain could play the blues like Eric Clapton, and he became the god of guitar in the eyes of the mods. But since the mods were all about novelty, the London bands gradually evolved from basic rhythm and blues to other directions, experimenting with scales, rhythms, studio technology, and all sorts of ideas that they brought from art schools. The art schools deserve a special mention here. The design of the welfare state was such that it decided which kids would go to which type of school, and the art school was where it sent kids that didn't fit anywhere else. Which meant that by the mid-60s, you had a bunch of social misfits armed with cultural and aesthetic ideas, and ready to unleash them on the world through pop music. The Yardbirds were influenced as well, and in 1965 they released the record For Your Love, which combined Eastern scales, sound effects and rhythm changes. It gave them the biggest hit, but made them lose Clapton, who could not abide this betrayal of the pure spirit of the blues. Clapton left the band, and was replaced by Jeff Beck, who was known for his experiments with producing novel sounds from the electric guitar and integrating them into the music. Here they take I'm a Man, a Chicago blues classic, and deconstruct it in a lethal guitar assault. The mods continued to update their musical taste, and as the 60s bore on, they turned more to the exhilarating and danceable Motown soul and to Jamaican ska, which they danced in discotheques. In general, the mods preferred discotheques to live shows, because there the attention could be on them and not on the band. They were the ones responsible for turning the discotheque into what it was from then on, a place where people go to flaunt their fashion sense and dancing abilities. And there was another thing that the mods introduced into youth culture. To always remain in the loop and never miss a thing, they would load themselves with stimulants, and they were the ones who brought the drugs in and paved the way to psychedelia. The effect of the mods on British culture was massive. The constant need to provide them with new accessories set the fashion and music industry into a swing, and turned London into the colourful and vibrant heart of pop culture in the mid-60s. Out of this atmosphere emerged The Who, a band that took the spirit of innovation to new realms, deconstructing rock and roll and putting it back together in all sorts of ways. Here they provide youth culture with one of its greatest anthems, a song that sends off those adults who rebuke the kids for spending their money on having fun instead of saving it for tomorrow. These adults, determined The Who, have lost their soul, and it is better to die young than be like them. Note the look. The rivalry between the mods made the clothes and haircuts become more and more flamboyant, and by 1966, they already looked like 18th century aristocrats. Dandyism was what it was all about. But there was someone in our story that we left behind, someone who, as we mentioned, did not like this direction that the mods were going in. Eric Clapton regarded the perpetual transformations of the mods as a sign of shallowness. To him, the blues was a deeply spiritual music, which he wanted to explore. After leaving the Yardbirds, he joined John Mayall and the Bluesbreakers, the leading British band among those who remained faithful to original R&B. There, in the purest blues scene, he met bassist Jack Bruce and drummer Ginger Baker, and the three formed Cream, intending to fight back against the mods and bring back real blues into the pop world. Their debut album from 1966 was packed with powerful blues, with tracks that were longer and heavier than customary rock and roll, and it had considerable success. But the band found its true identity when acid rock appeared, because it opened the door to improvisations, and since the three were much better instrumentalists than anyone the San Francisco bands had to offer, they could take it to new levels.
leaden winter would bring you down forever, but you rode upon a steamer to the violence of the sun.
Cream's music became a melting pot of jazz, blues, acid and rock and roll. Along with Bob Dylan's band, they laid the foundations to rock. In 1967 they released the album Disraeli Years, one of the classic albums of psychedelia.
Waves are calling you to kiss the white lace dance.
Cream, then, shifted the emphasis from the external to the internal, from outbursts of pure instinct to more complex emotions, and from style changes from one record to another to changes within a single record. They demonstrate the effect that psychedelia had on British rhythm and blues, an effect that was felt across the board.
Now my girl, you're so young and free, and one thing I know is true, yeah, you'll be dead before your time is due, I know it. Watch my daddy in bed time, his hair been turning gray.
These are The Animals, a Newcastle band that was one of the leading lights of the R&B scene. The Animals were a pretty gloomy band, but acid changed all that. Eric Burdon, the singer, moved to San Francisco to make music with the hippies, whereas bass player Chas Chandler switched to managing, and had the luck of introducing the world to the greatest psychedelic artist of all. In late 1966 he went to New York to attend a performance by a black guitarist who was said to be something special, and was astounded by what he saw. Chandler managed to persuade Jimi Hendrix to come to London, where he teamed him up with a bassist and a drummer, to form a trio that was meant to rival Cream. In no time, they surpassed it. In the first and fourth chapters we mentioned the concept of it, which for the beatnik signified that you are connected to reality, flowing along with it, driving yourself from within and not just spectating your life through preconceived scripts. If there was anyone in music who came close to the ideal of it was Jimi Hendrix. In his playing, Hendrix seemed to fuse with the guitar and turn into an expression of the life flowing within him, and his ability to direct it wherever he wants. His mastery of the variety of sounds that could be produced by the instrument was impeccable, and he combined acid rock improvisations with mind-blowing psychedelic sounds to intoxicate the listener. The name of his band, the Jimi Hendrix Experience, reminds us of Timothy Leary's book, symbolizing that they were what psychedelia is about. When they released the second single, in March 1967, about purple haze filling your brain and generating a transcendent feeling, he established his stature as a central figure of psychedelia. Shortly after, the band released its first album, Are You Experienced?, one of psychedelia's most important manifestos. In the title track, Hendrix is inviting us to join him on a trip through different states of consciousness, a trip that will end up with us knowing ourselves better. In short, he promises to do to us what the merry pranksters try to do in their acid tests, take us to the other side, to where we can see existence from the inside. But while the pranksters preach that hallucinogens are the key to open the door to that other side, Hendrix tells us that we don't have to be stoned. There are other techniques. What are these techniques? Well, I believe that there's a wide consensus that one of the best ways to have a psychedelic trip is to listen to the Jimi Hendrix Experience.
Have you ever been experienced? Well, I have.
For the mods, who grew up on the blues and saw it as the deepest expression of the human spirit, Hendrix was a quintessential guitarist, a man who played the blues better than any British guitarist, as well as taking it in new directions. But Hendrix also ended the reign of the mods over British pop. To anyone who saw him in performance, he appeared as a nature child, something more primordial and real than anything civilization has created, and suddenly the mod attitude seemed toothless. Rather than always being the most modern, as the mods demanded, youth culture started to think in terms of going back to nature. In other words, be like the Flower Children. After his unforgettable performance in the Monterey Pop Festival, he took over San Francisco as well, and then the entire world. In contrast with the rhythm and blues bands we've met so far, for which psychedelia was just a phase in their development, the Jimi Hendrix Experience already belonged to the next generation, a band that was conceived as a psychedelic band. Another such band was the Pink Floyd. The name of the band, like many other British bands of that period, came from the blues, and was a combination of the names of two blues musicians, Pink Anderson and Floyd Council. But this weird juxtaposition, said band leader Syd Barrett, came to him in a dream, symbolizing the transition into the world of illusion and imagination. We've already mentioned the Pink Floyd as the leading British acid rock band, but the band also had a gifted songwriter in the form of Barrett, so it could make 3-minute pop records as well. Their first single came out in March '67 and was still somehow connected to the world of the mods, telling of a man named Arnold Lane who likes to dress up. But a more careful listening reveals the transformation. Arnold is a transvestite who likes to wear women's clothes which he steals from washing lines, and since his actions are against the law, he can't wear them in public. He wears them only in the seclusion of his own home, standing in front of the mirror, and imagining that he is getting a glance into his own soul. Unlike the mods, who combined individualism with collectivism, and dressed up to impress their friends according to a mutual taste, here it is something that is completely personal, done to express an inner diversion. Their next single came out in June, and is one of the defining records of the Summer of Love.
Emily tries but misunderstands.
Again, it is about someone who borrows from others, but while Arnold took their clothes, Emily wants to borrow other people's dreams to fill her spiritually impoverished world. Here we are entering even deeper, on the expense of the external. When Emily wears something, it is a gown that touches the ground, something that covers her body instead of displaying it. This part of her being is of no interest to her. That summer also saw the release of the band's wonderful debut album, bringing together flights in space and in fantasy, Eastern mysticism, childhood memories, imaginary creatures and strange experiences, all wrapped up in colorful cellophanes of cutting-edge studio technology, acid rock, Eastern scales and otherworldly sounds. The kaleidoscopic cover shows the band members still resplendent in fancy clothes. In the summer of '67, there was still unity between the internal and the external, as the clothes became more colorful and gaudy, expressing the spirit of psychedelia. But you could already sense the change. The Pink Floyd made 3 consecutive appearances on Top of the Pops that summer, singing their hit song See Emily Play. For the first appearance, Syd Barrett came dressed in a dashing vibrant suit, befitting a pop star. For the second performance he came in the same suit, and it looked like he slept in it all week. And for the last performance he came dressed in rags, displaying his contempt. Looking good was no longer important to him, and other people on the scene were starting to feel the same way. The band's next single arrived in November, and was called Apples and Oranges. It is about a high society chick who likes to shop and dress up, while the singer is a simple working class man, but he feels superior to her, since he has a deep inner world while she seems superficial to him. Here we see a complete separation between the internal and the external. They used to be compatible, but now they are like apples and oranges. Along with the Jimi Hendrix Experience and the Pink Floyd, the third most important psychedelic band was of course the Grateful Dead. Initially, the band would just cover songs written by others, improvising and playing fast in order to get the acid test participants to dance wild and free. That's what we hear in their debut album, that does not achieve masterpiece level. But in 1967 the band began to establish a unique style that was no longer relying on found material, but on original cuts that were designed as long formless pieces, based on improvisation, and incessant attempts to discover new rhythms and sounds. The music would change pace, and sometimes get into slow meditative passages, intended not for dancing but for sinking into dreams. The lyrics, accordingly, dealt with hippie life philosophy and with mystical experiences. In 1968 they released their second album, Anthem of the Sun, a psychedelic milestone, in which all the pieces dissolve into each other, turning the album into one elongated piece. These spiritual changes led to a fundamental change in youth culture fashion. Instead of the short and coiffed haircuts of the mods, now the attitude was to let your hair go wild, like a nature child. Instead of looking dapper, now it was about looking like a hobo, in disheveled clothes. Many clothes were appropriated from cultures that were seen as closer to nature, like the Native Americans, or mystical, like the Indians. This was the hippie style. Meanwhile, the combined attack of Hendrix and Cream caused a sea change in British rhythm and blues, and begat what became known as blues rock, relatively slow music with a bluesy feel, based on long solos of electric guitar. Again it was John Mayall and the Blues Breakers, the band that Eric Clapton left for Cream, that continued to export musicians that determined the sound of the era. In place of Clapton, the band recruited another gifted guitarist named Peter Green, who left in '67 to form the blues rock band Fleetwood Mac. That year, they released an instrumental piece that became one of the most popular records of the year, and captured the mystical mood of the time. Green's substitute in the Blues Breakers was Mick Taylor, who left in 1969 to replace another blonde guitarist, Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones, whose drug addiction became a liability and got him kicked out of the band. This change symbolizes the change that the rock world went through at the time. Jones was a very talented musician, but his talent wasn't in playing long solos, but rather in finding novel ways to play an instrument. On many Stones records from the years 66-67, you can hear him play an instrument he picked up just hours before, but already he finds ways to produce sounds that stimulate the ear and add to the psychedelic soothe. We've already seen him play sitar on Painted Black and Mellotron on 2000 Light Years from Home, and we heard him play the harp on She Comes in Colors. In Movie Tuesday, another typical Summer of Love record, he plays both recorder and cello.
While the sun is bright, or in the darkest night, no one knows. She comes and goes. Goodbye, Ruby Tuesday. Who could hang a name on you when you change every new day? Girl, I'm gonna miss you.
But the Stones could not remain oblivious to the changes around them, and they too wanted to make blues rock with the power of two electric guitars. It was no longer about making records with an interesting mix of sounds, but about rocking it out. Taylor was brought in Jones's place, and the first record put out by the new lineup was an expression of its new style, but also took the band back to its roots, with sexy and sexist lyrics, and rock blues that revitalizes both body and soul. And so, in the battle between the purist approach of the Blues Breakers and the constant regeneration approach of the mods, in the late 60s the former emerged as victorious. The best evidence of this victory is what happened to the Yardbirds, the band that Eric Clapton ditched for the Bluesbreakers. Here we see them perform a psychedelic song called Shapes of Things, and the kneeling guitarist is Jeff Beck, Clapton's replacement. But at the end of '66, Beck decided that he too wants to go deep into the blues, and so he left the Yardbirds and formed the Jeff Beck Group, who are seen here performing the same song in blues rock style. The singer of the band was known as Rod the Mod Stewart, so called because he was one of the most flamboyant mods. In the mid-60s it seemed like all he cared about was fashion, but now he was suddenly revealed as an excellent singer. Along with Janis Joplin and a few others, Stewart established a style that would typify blues rock singers, a husky shout, full of emotions and soul. After Beck's departure, the Yardbirds had a new lead guitarist, a powerful virtuoso named Jimmy Page. Page became the driving force of the band until mid-1968, when they disbanded in the middle of the tour. Page was left with 2 engagements he was contractually obliged to, so he swiftly recruited a few friends to form a new band, and Led Zeppelin was launched to the world, with a style very different from the Yardbirds. In Led Zeppelin, the power of Page found its counterparts, with the mighty drummer John Bonham and with vocalist Robert Plant, who took blues rock singing even further, developing a style of high-pitched screaming. This was even more powerful than what Hendrix and Cream were doing, and stepped out of the boundaries of blues rock to lay the foundations for a new musical culture. In short, after 1967, rock guitarists no longer wanted to make 3-minute records. They wanted to make room for long solos, where they could express a myriad of emotions. Until '67, pop and rock and roll were almost synonymous, but from here on, those who belonged to the rock world started to regard pop with disdain, seeing it as superficial and juvenile. The world of the mods, a world based on pop and fashion, made way to the world of the hippies, that was based on rock and spirituality. In this world, the mods could no longer exist. The influence of psychedelia made elements in their identity drift too far away from each other, until they could no longer be contained in the same identity, and the subculture imploded. But what happened to the rockers at that time? Here, too, acid rock brought about an essential change. As we recall, there were 2 biker gangs in the Wild One movie. Marlon Brando's gang, wearing black leather jackets, and the scruffy Lee Marvin gang. The rockers emulated Brando's gang, but there were those who dug the rival gang better. In 1955, one of the leaders of a California biker gang rode into Hollywood and purchased a striped shirt Marvin wore in the movie, to express his solidarity with the character. It was a sign of things to come, because his gang, the Hells Angels, would become the most notorious biker gang. The Hells Angels became a menace in California, riding around in groups, always happy to gang up on anyone who gave them slight offense, living outside the rules of conformed society. Everyone feared them, but the hippies idolized them as symbols of a free life lived on the road, and were therefore willing to ignore their violent side. The Angels, on their part, thought that the hippies were wimps, but enjoyed hanging out in the acid parties with all the sex and drugs, so the 2 groups got along. The result was the emergence of a new biker look, combining the rocker, hippie and Hells Angel styles. Long hair, grungy appearance, a sleeveless denim jacket, jeans and boots. The rocker's leather jacket and helmet were now frowned upon as something that only cowards would wear, and the uniform look was not popular either. Everyone was expected to give an individual touch to their look. Rather than leaning forward on their bike and slashing the air like the rockers did, the bikers now leaned backwards, letting the wind blow in their face, enjoying nature. I like smoke and lightning, heavy metal thunder, sings Steppenwolf. This was the other side of acid rock, its power. Acid rock was music that was played louder than any other style that came before it, and could be experienced not only in the spiritual manner of the hippies, but also in a purely sensual manner, just submitting to the sheer force of the music. This was the side that appealed to those who came from workers' quarters, those who were not about meditation but about remaining true to the pounding rock and roll of old. And in 1969, around the time that the first Led Zeppelin album was released, they detached from acid rock and formed a new style, heavy metal. The metal fans worshipped the power of electric guitar, and intensified the element of power and virtuosity found in the blues rock of Cream and Hendrix. From here on they are no longer part of our story, but in '68 you can still find the seeds of metal in acid rock, like for instance in this number by Iron Butterfly.
Please take my hand.
And so, from 1968 onward, rock and roll became rock. All those styles that were based on ecstatic 3-minute records, like rock and roll, rockabilly, doo-wop, surf, mercy beat, rhythm and blues and folk rock, have been pushed to the sidelines. In their place came styles based on albums made of extended tracks, full of electric guitar and keyboard solos, acid rock, blues rock, heavy metal, and some other styles that we will mention in the upcoming chapters. The 3-minute record became associated with pop, a term that was now despised. Youth culture saw itself as having matured, passing from rock and roll to rock, to more serious music. Another deep transformation occurred in its perception of identity. Up to 1967, youth culture was based on subcultures, like Teds, surfers, mods and rockers. That is, cultures that saw themselves as part of the dominant culture, even as they were rebelling against it. When the hippie culture came and devoured all other subcultures, a new attitude began to emerge, of a culture that sees itself as superior to the dominant culture, and wants to break away from it completely, or even replace it. In early 1969, British television broadcasted a special hosted by the singer Lulu, one of the young singers who symbolized the mod culture of the mid-60s. The Jimi Hendrix Experience were among the guest performers, and the plan was for them to do a duet with Lulu on Hey Joe, which was their first hit. They start playing the song as planned, but at the moment when she was supposed to join them, they stopped.
We'd like to stop playing this rubbish and dedicate a song to the Cream, regardless of what kind of group they might be in. We'd like to dedicate to Eric Clapton, Ginger Baker, and Jack Bruce.
Cream just announced that they are disbanding, so Jimi plays one of their songs as tribute, and does it Hendrix style, meaning an all-out guitar assault that doesn't belong in a show hosted by Lulu. We can see him smirking at the show's producers, who were probably pulling their hair out watching this stunt, and he keeps on blasting until they pull him off the air. They could have avoided this fiasco had they been more attuned to the changes within the rock world. Then they would have realized that someone like Hendrix cannot possibly share a stage with someone like Lulu. It was no longer a unified youth culture. From here on, it was about mainstream culture and counterculture.
We're being put up there.